Hello, and welcome to our series of Lent readings considering people who encountered Jesus. Today, it's day 6, and we started this week looking at one of the first disciples called by Jesus, who was Andrew. Today, we're going to look at, arguably, his more well-known brother, Simon, also known as Peter. As we saw yesterday, Andrew, after meeting Jesus, immediately went and found his brother Simon to tell him he had met the Messiah. Simon was with Andrew that day beside Galilee fishing when Jesus walked past and called them to follow. And they both left their nets and they would spend the next 3 years travelling with Jesus. Peter has become well known for some of his impulsive acts, like jumping out of a boat to walk to Jesus on the water before sinking, of making great claims of loyalty to Jesus before denying him 3 times. Despite all this, Jesus recognized the potential in Peter for future leadership. The characteristics that led to some of his mistakes when younger would be harnessed through the experience of walking with Jesus to produce the person who would stand up in front of a crowd on the day of Pentecost and preach the first sermon of the church, resulting in 3,000 baptisms. There is a point when Jesus highlights what Simon would become by renaming him Peter, which means rock. Peter, Petros, where we get the word petrified from, turned to stone. What turned Simon from someone who acted first then thought later to the leader of the church was the impact of walking with Jesus. I want to look at one of the events from that time when he walked with Jesus that left a particular mark upon him. And we read it in Matthew 17, the first 8 verses. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James and John, the brother of James, and led them up high onto a mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. Just then, there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell down to the ground. They were terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. Peter, as we shall call him from this point onwards, became one of those 3 inner disciples with James and John, who we'll look at over the next couple of days. These 3 would accompany Jesus at times when it was not appropriate for all 12 to be present. They were there when Jesus raised the daughter of a synagogue ruler from the dead. They were there in the Garden of Gethsemane just before Jesus was arrested. Peter, as we read, was also one of those on the mountain when Jesus was transfigured. He experienced so much in those 3 years when he was with Jesus. He must have had many stories to tell, but this event on the mountain had a particular impact upon him. And we know that because later he would go on to write about it. Peter wrote 2 letters, and in the second one, 2 Peter, in the first chapters, from verse 16 to 18, he says this: "For we did not follow cleverly devised stories when we told you about the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ in power, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. We received honour and glory from God the Father. He received honour and glory from God the Father when the voice came to him from the majestic glory saying, 'This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased.' We ourselves heard this voice, that came from heaven when we were with him on the sacred mountain. Peter became convinced that Jesus was the Messiah, the hope of the world, not just because of what people said about him or what Jesus said about himself. Peter was convinced because he'd seen the glory of God. We also need an experience of God's glory in our own lives. If our faith in Jesus is just based on the testimony of others, it will be shallow. Good as these things are, we need something more. We need our own glimpse of God's glory. For Peter, this did more than just transform his understanding. It transformed his character from shaky to rocky. May we too be transformed into all that Jesus wants us to be by an experience of the glory of God. Until next time, have a blessed day.